Help us reach 1,000 subscribers on our new channel Lesbian Stories. I never expected my life to change dramatically in the dusty basement of Montgomery Museum, but that's exactly what happened when I discovered the ancient lyre. My hands trembled as I brushed away centuries of dirt, revealing intricate carvings that would soon intertwine my fate with a woman who'd turn my world upside down. "Dr. Walsh, you might want to see this," my assistant called out, his voice echoing through the storage room. I adjusted my glasses, squinting at the artifact's unusual markings. It's definitely pre-Columbian, but these symbols, something wasn't adding up. That evening, desperate for a break from the overwhelming questions surrounding our find, I did something completely out of character. Instead of heading home to my quiet apartment filled with research papers, I followed the sound of electric guitars to a dingy bar called The Vault. That's where I first saw her. Wren Rivers, bathed in purple stage lights, her blonde hair wild as she commanded the stage with her guitar. The way her fingers danced across the strings reminded me of the ancient musicians depicted on the artifacts we'd found. I couldn't take my eyes off her. "First time here?" A voice startled me from my trance. The bartender smiled knowingly. "Desert storms got that effect on people, especially when Wren's playing." I nursed my whiskey, trying to maintain my professional composure even as the music seemed to reach into my chest and grab hold of something I'd kept buried for years. When the set ended, I found myself drawing comparisons between the modern guitar techniques and the ancient musical patterns we'd discovered. "Fascinating theory," a husky voice said behind me. I turned to find Wren herself, still gleaming with sweat from the performance, her green eyes intense and curious. "You know much about ancient music, Professor?" "Dr. Morgan Walsh," I corrected automatically, then felt foolish. "And yes, actually, we just uncovered some interesting artifacts today that might suggest—" I caught myself rambling and stopped. "Don't stop now," Wren grinned, sliding onto the bar stool next to me. "I love it when beautiful women talk nerdy to me." I felt heat rise to my cheeks, torn between professional interest and something far more dangerous. The markings suggest a complex musical tradition we hadn't previously documented in this region. "Show me?" The way she asked made it sound like more than just professional curiosity. Against my better judgment, I found myself leading her back to the museum after hours, my heart racing as I swiped my security card. The empty halls echoed with our footsteps, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. In the basement lab, Wren's fingers traced the air above the lyre, respecting museum protocol even in her fascination. "It's like looking at my guitar's great-great-grandmother," she whispered. When she looked up at me, the intensity in her eyes made my breath catch. "I have a crazy idea," she said, moving slightly closer. "What if we combined this ancient music with modern rock? A collaboration between Desert Storm and history?" I should have said no, should have maintained professional boundaries. Instead, I heard myself say, "Tell me more." As we talked into the early hours, surrounded by artifacts and possibility, I realized I wasn't just falling for her idea, I was falling for her. And that terrified me more than any archaeological mystery ever could. The next morning, my colleague Richard eyed my disheveled appearance suspiciously. "Late night researching, Dr. Walsh?" If he only knew how that night would change everything. The next few weeks became a delicate dance between maintaining my professional reputation and fighting the magnetic pull toward Wren. I'd invited her to consult on the ancient instruments, a decision my colleagues met with raised eyebrows and whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. "Your rocker friend certainly brings an interesting perspective," Dr. Harrison commented one morning, his tone dripping with academic condescension. I gripped my coffee mug tighter, forcing a neutral expression. "Ms. Rivers has provided valuable insights into the practical applications of these instruments," I replied coolly. What I didn't mention was how watching her hands demonstrate playing techniques made my pulse race, or how her presence turned my typically sterile office into something electric. Later that afternoon, Wren lounged in my visitor's chair, boots propped on my desk despite my previous protests. "These markings," she said, pointing to my research photos, "they're not just decorative. They're like ancient guitar tablature, but for their instruments." I leaned closer to see where she was pointing, catching the scent of her leather jacket mixed with something floral. "That actually makes sense," I admitted, struggling to focus on the photographs rather than our proximity. "You know," Wren said softly, For someone so brilliant, you work awful hard at playing it safe. Her eyes met mine, and the air seemed to crackle between us. I don't play anything, I retorted, immediately regretting my defensive tone. My work requires careful consideration and… Bullshit, she interrupted, standing up. I've seen how you look at me when you think I'm not watching, how your hands shake when I get too close. She moved around my desk, and I found myself rising to meet her. This is highly unprofessional, I whispered, even as I remained rooted to the spot. Then tell me to leave. Her challenge hung in the air between us. The sound of approaching footsteps in the hallway broke the moment. I stepped back quickly, pretending to examine a document as my assistant knocked and entered with some paperwork requiring my signature. That evening, long after everyone else had left, I was still in my office, staring at the same page of notes without reading them. A soft knock made me jump. Forgot my jacket, Ren said, slipping inside and closing the door. But her jacket was already over her arm. Ren, I can't. I started, but she was already moving closer. Can't what? Feel? Live? Break out of this carefully constructed shell you've built? Her words hit too close to home. You don't understand. My career, my reputation, are excuses, she finished. Tell me you don't feel this too, and I'll walk away. In the dim light of my desk lamp, with ancient artifacts watching like silent witnesses, I finally stopped fighting. When our lips met, it felt like discovering something both ancient and completely new. The moment was interrupted by the night security guard's flashlight beam sweeping past my office window. We broke apart, and I felt the weight of reality crash back down. This can't happen again, I said, straightening my blouse with trembling hands. Ren just smiled, touching her fingers to her lips. Keep telling yourself that, Professor, but we both know you're already composing our next movement. She left me there, surrounded by centuries of history, but unable to focus on anything except the present moment, the lingering warmth of her lips, and the terrifying knowledge that my carefully ordered world was about to become gloriously chaotic. The next morning, I found a small note slipped under my office door. Some of the greatest discoveries in history happened because someone dared to break the rules. Below it was an address and time Desert Storm's next underground show. I tucked the note into my pocket, telling myself I wouldn't go. But we both knew that was another lie I was telling myself. The address led me to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Montgomery. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, debating whether to go in, my sensible sedan looking completely out of place among the motorcycles and vintage cars. Dr. Walsh actually showed up. A voice drawled. I turned to find Lisa, Desert Storm's bassist, leaning against my car. Ren said you would, but I had my doubts. Inside, the warehouse had been transformed. String lights crisscrossed the ceiling, and the smell of incense mixed with beer and sweat. I felt painfully overdressed in my work clothes, but Ren's face lit up when she spotted me. You made it, she bounded over, guitar still strapped to her back. Think of it as field research, contemporary musical anthropology. The music was nothing like I expected. Desert Storm played complex arrangements that reminded me of ancient modal scales. I found myself taking mental notes, drawing parallels between their sound and the markings on our artifacts. Want a private tour of the scene? Ren appeared at my elbow during their break, offering her hand. Against my better judgment, I took it. She led me through hidden doors and secret passages, explaining how the underground music community operated. Every city has spaces like this, she said, where people can be themselves without judgment. We ended up on the warehouse roof, the city lights spreading out before us. Ren pulled out her acoustic guitar, playing a melody that made my heart ache. That's similar to the pattern on the lyre, I said, surprised. The progression is almost identical too. The carvings you showed me? She smiled. I've been studying them. Music doesn't change as much as we think it does. The human heart still beats the same rhythm. Later that night, Ren suggested an impromptu visit to the museum. I want to show you something, she insisted, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Using my security clearance felt wrong, but I was past caring. In the quiet galleries, Ren's boots echoed on marble floors as she led me to the ancient instruments display. Listen, she whispered, pulling out her phone. She played a recording of Desert Storm's latest song, then pointed to the markings on the ancient drum. Same pattern, different century. Her enthusiasm was contagious. I found myself explaining the historical significance, getting lost in the connections between past and present. When I looked up, Ren was watching me with an intensity that made me forget what I was saying. "God, you're beautiful when you're passionate about something," she murmured, stepping closer. The security camera's red light blinked in the corner, but I couldn't bring myself to care. When Ren kissed me this time, it was different from our office encounter, slower, deeper, filled with promise. A distant door slammed, making us jump apart. "Night guard," I whispered, pulling her into a hidden alcove. We stood pressed together in the darkness, trying not to laugh as footsteps passed by. "This is insane," I breathed once the guard had moved on. "I'm risking everything, my career, my reputation." "Maybe that's exactly what you need," Ren replied, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "When was the last time you felt this alive?" The truth was, I couldn't remember. Years of careful academic pursuit had left me successful but hollow. Now, standing in a dark museum with a rock star's arms around me, I felt more connected to the ancient artifacts than ever. "Come to band practice tomorrow," Ren said as we finally left the museum. "No pressure, just be there." I nodded, already knowing I'd go. The lines between professional interest and personal desire were blurring beyond recognition, and for once in my life I didn't want to analyze it. Walking to my car, I caught my reflection in a window. Cheeks flushed, hair slightly messed up, looking nothing like the proper Dr. Walsh. Instead of fixing it, I smiled, humming one of Desert Storm's songs under my breath. Behind me, the museum stood dark and dignified, holding centuries of secrets. Now it held one more, and somehow that felt right. Band practice was held in a converted garage that smelled of stale coffee and cigarettes. I stood awkwardly in the corner, clutching my leather briefcase like a shield, while the band set up their equipment. "Ever played anything?" Lisa asked, adjusting her bass strings. "Piano, years ago. For classical training," I admitted. Ren's head snapped up from her guitar tuning. "Classical training? Why didn't you tell me?" She grabbed my hand, pulling me toward their keyboard setup. "Show us what you've got, Professor." My fingers hovered over the keys, muscle memory from years of practice flooding back. Without thinking, I began playing a Bach piece, but somehow it morphed into something else, something that matched the rhythms we'd found carved into those ancient instruments. "Holy shit," Ren whispered. The whole band had stopped to listen. "Do that again, but this time." She played a guitar riff alongside my improvisation, and suddenly the music transformed into something entirely new. Hours passed like minutes. We experimented with combining classical structures and rock progressions, creating a sound that seemed to bridge centuries. I forgot about being Dr. Walsh, forgot about professional boundaries and academic reputation. "You're a natural," Ren grinned, her face flushed with excitement. "You have to join us for the next show." Reality crashed back. I couldn't possibly. The museum board would. "Dr. Walsh?" A familiar voice cut through the music. Standing in the doorway was Janet Peterson, one of the museum's most conservative board members, looking utterly scandalized. My heart stopped. She must have followed me, suspicious of my recent behavior. "Mrs. Peterson, I can explain. This is research for—" "Save it," she snapped. "Emergency board meeting tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp." She turned on her heel, leaving behind a silence heavier than any bass line. "I'll lose everything," I whispered, panic rising. "My career, the research grant." Ren stepped forward, but I backed away. "Don't. This is exactly what I was afraid of." Back in my office that evening, I was frantically preparing my defense when a knock interrupted my spiral. "We're closed," I called out. "It's me," Ren's voice was soft. "The security guard let me in. Said something about you needing dinner." She set down a paper bag that smelled of Thai food. "I'm not letting you face this alone." "You don't understand," I said, pacing. "Years of work, my entire reputation." "Actually, I do understand." She pulled out her phone, showing me an email. "I reached out to some colleagues in the music archaeology field. They're fascinated by our fusion experiment, called it groundbreaking research into practical applications of ancient musical theory." During the board meeting the next morning, Ren waited outside. I presented our findings, explaining how combining ancient techniques with modern music was providing new insights into historical performance practices. "And the rock band," Mrs. Peterson asked acidly. "Is providing invaluable practical expertise," a voice interrupted. Dr. James Chen, head of the musicology department at the State University, walked in. Dr. Walsh's work has caught the attention of our department. We'd like to collaborate on a joint research project. The board's attitude shifted visibly. Suddenly, my unconventional methods became innovative approaches. After the meeting, I found Ren in the hallway. "You called Dr. Chen?" She shrugged. "I have connections in weird places. Besides, everything I told him was true. We're doing something revolutionary here." Looking at her then, I realized something had shifted. This wasn't just about breaking free anymore. We were creating something meaningful together. "So," she said, a familiar mischief in her eyes, "ready for your debut performance?" Instead of answering, I pulled her into an empty conference room and kissed her, not caring who might see. Sometimes the biggest discoveries come from embracing the unexpected. "I'll take that as a yes," she laughed against my lips. Outside, I could hear the board members still discussing the exciting new direction of the museum's research. If they only knew how exciting it was about to become. My double life began in earnest. By day, I was still Dr. Walsh, leading archaeological researcher, but my nights belonged to Desert Storm. We practiced in secret, developing a sound that blended ancient modal scales with modern rock energy. I kept my keyboard parts subtle at first, like a scholar dipping her toes into forbidden waters. "Stop holding back," Ren encouraged during one late-night session. "You're thinking too much about what others expect from Dr. Walsh. Show me who Morgan really is." She was right. That night, I let go, channeling years of repressed passion into the music. The result was electric. The band fell silent when we finished the song, until Lisa whispered, "Damn, Professor." Word spread through the underground music scene about Desert Storm's evolving sound. Our practice sessions started drawing small crowds of musicians and music students. I wore sunglasses and kept my hair down, but rumors began circulating about the mysterious new keyboardist. "Have you seen the online buzz?" Ren showed me her phone one evening. Music blogs were speculating about our upcoming tour, praising the fusion of classical elements with rock. "We're trending in 3 cities." The tour. My stomach lurched at the thought. We'd been asked to play a series of shows across the state, starting with a major venue in Montgomery. I'd already requested time off for field research, but the reality of performing publicly terrified me. "Dr. Walsh?" My assistant knocked on my office door, interrupting my thoughts. "There's something you should see." He handed me a local entertainment magazine. There on page 6 was a blurry photo of me leaving band practice, Ren's arm around my waist. The caption read, "Local archaeologist Dr. Morgan Walsh, spotted with indie rock sensation Desert Storm. Sources suggest a surprising collaboration in the works." My hands shook as I set down the magazine. It was only a matter of time before my colleagues saw it. The carefully constructed walls between my 2 worlds were crumbling. That afternoon, I overheard whispers in the museum hallways. "Did you see? Who would have thought? Rather unprofessional, isn't it?" Dr. Harrison cornered me in the artifact storage room. "Morgan, as your friend, I'm concerned. This, dalliance with popular music, it's raising eyebrows." "It's research," I defended weakly. "Is that all it is?" His eyes were knowing. "The board may have approved your methods, but there are limits to their tolerance." Later, Ren found me in my office staring at the magazine. "We knew this might happen," she said softly. "I'm not ready," I admitted. "My whole life, I've been the serious academic, the responsible one. Now everyone's going to see." "The real you?" Ren perched on my desk. "The brilliant woman who can translate ancient musical notations and rock a keyboard solo? The one who makes my heart race every time she walks into a room?" I looked up at her, this beautiful chaos that had stormed into my life. "What if I fail?" "Then you'll fail being authentically you. Better than succeeding at being someone else's version of you." She was right, of course. That evening, during practice, I ditched my usual conservative blouse for one of Ren's band t-shirts. When I played, I didn't hold back. The next morning, Dr. Chen visited unexpectedly. I braced for criticism, but instead, he smiled. "I heard your rehearsal tape. The way you're interpreting those ancient patterns. It's revolutionary. You're not concerned about the rock elements? Music evolves, Dr. Walsh. Perhaps it's time academia did too." As he left, I caught my reflection in the window. My hair was messy, my clothes less than professional, but my eyes were bright with purpose. The woman in the glass wasn't just Dr. Walsh anymore, but she wasn't just Desert Storm's keyboardist either. She was finally completely me. That night, Ren and I celebrated by sneaking into the museum after hours. Among the ancient instruments, we played a quiet duet, her guitar and my humming merging with centuries of musical history. "Ready to tell the world who you really are?" she asked. Looking at our first tour poster, my name now officially listed as a band member, I nodded. Let them talk. We're making history. The day of Desert Storm's headline show arrived with an ultimatum. Dr. Harrison stood in my office doorway, his expression grave. "The board wants you to choose, Morgan. Either you're a respected archaeologist or a rock musician. You can't be both." I stared at the contract renewal papers on my desk, then at the museum staff photo hanging on my wall. 15 years of dedication captured in one formal portrait. "When do they need my answer?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "By tomorrow morning." He paused. "For what it's worth, I think they're wrong." Hours later, I stood backstage at the vault, watching through the curtain as the venue filled beyond capacity. Music journalists, academics, and curious locals packed the space, all wondering about the archaeologist who'd crossed over to rock. Having second thoughts? Ren appeared beside me, already in her stage clothes, leather pants, and a vintage t-shirt that made my heart skip. About a dozen per minute, I admitted. I'd chosen a black blazer over a band shirt, trying to bridge my two worlds. The board can wait, she interrupted. Tonight isn't about them. It's about the music we've created together. The lights dimmed, and the crowd's energy shifted. Lisa and the others took their places, and Ren squeezed my hand before grabbing her guitar. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed, "please welcome Desert Storm." The roar of the crowd hit me like a physical force. Ren launched into our opening riff, and muscle memory took over as I joined in. The melody we'd crafted wove ancient patterns through modern rhythms, building to something entirely new. I caught sight of familiar faces in the audience, museum colleagues, board members, even Dr. Chen, all watching with varying degrees of shock and appreciation. But as the music flowed through me, their opinions mattered less and less. Halfway through our set, Ren stepped up to the microphone. "Tonight, we're making history," she announced. "Dr. Morgan Walsh isn't just an archaeologist studying ancient music. She's helping us bring it back to life." She nodded to me, and I began the solo we'd been practicing in secret. My fingers danced across the keys, weaving classical training with rock energy, centuries of musical evolution compressed into minutes. The audience fell silent, then erupted. In that moment, I wasn't choosing between two worlds. I was creating a new one. After the show, still buzzing with adrenaline, Ren pulled me into the green room. "That was incredible," she whispered, pressing me against the door. Her kiss tasted of sweat and triumph. A knock interrupted us. "Dr. Walsh?" It was Dr. Chen. "A moment?" Ren squeezed my hand and slipped out. I straightened my blazer, preparing for another ultimatum. Instead, Dr. Chen smiled. "I'm starting a new research program at the university, contemporary applications of historical music. We need someone who understands both worlds. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you freedom to be both the scholar and the artist. The university's more progressive than the museum board." Later that night, Ren and I lay tangled together in her apartment, the city lights painting patterns across her ceiling. "So, Professor," she murmured, tracing patterns on my skin, "ready to really break the rules?" I thought about the contract renewal sitting unsigned on my desk, about Dr. Chen's offer, about the way the audience had responded to our music. "You know what?" I pulled her closer. "I think I finally am." The next morning, I'd have to face the board, make decisions that would reshape my future. But for now, in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, I was exactly where I needed to be, caught between ancient rhythms and modern beats, between academic precision and rock and roll abandon, between Ren's heartbeat and my own. Outside, a street musician played something that could have been classical or could have been rock. The lines were blurring everywhere. The morning after our breakthrough performance, I walked into the museum for what I thought would be the last time. My resignation letter felt heavy in my bag, but after last night, there was no going back to being just Dr. Walsh. The security guard smiled knowingly. "Saw you on stage last night, Doc. My daughter hasn't stopped talking about it." News travels fast in Montgomery. By the time I reached my office, my inbox was flooded with emails, colleagues expressing everything from disappointment to unexpected support, music blogs requesting interviews, and students asking if I'd consider teaching a course on musical archaeology. "Your office looks different," Ren said from the doorway. She wasn't wrong. Amid the carefully organized academic papers, tour posters now hung beside archaeological diagrams, my two worlds finally coexisting. "The board's waiting," I told her, gathering my courage. "Want me to come with you?" I shook my head. "This part I need to do alone." The boardroom felt colder than usual. Mrs. Peterson sat at the head of the table, my contract renewal in front of her, unsigned. "Dr. Walsh, before you speak, we've seen the media coverage." I braced myself, but she continued. "And the unprecedented interest in our musical artifacts collection. Website traffic has increased 300% since last night." That wasn't what I expected. "I don't understand." "Neither do we," Dr. Harrison added. "But we can't deny the results. Young people are suddenly interested in archaeological music studies. 3 universities have contacted us about collaboration opportunities." "However," Mrs. Peterson interjected, "your recent behavior has been unconventional." I thought about Ren, about music that bridged millennia, about finally feeling alive. "With respect," I said, standing straighter, "convention hasn't gotten us closer to understanding how these instruments actually sounded, how they connected to their communities. Last night did." "Which brings us to Dr. Chen's offer," Mrs. Peterson said. My surprise must have shown. "Yes, we know about that too." What followed was 3 hours of negotiation, resulting in a compromise I never expected. I could continue my research at the museum while participating in the university's new program. And Desert Storm? They were officially classified as practical research collaborators. Walking back to my office, I felt lighter until I saw Ren's face. Something was wrong. "The label called," she said quietly. "They want to sign us. National tour, professional production, the works." My heart sank. "How long?" 6 months, minimum. We leave next week." She wouldn't meet my eyes. "I know you just sorted things out here." "Ren, I can't ask you to leave everything you've built," she interrupted. "Your work, your research." I touched her cheek, making her look at me. "Remember what you told me about breaking rules, about being authentically myself? This is different. This is your whole life." "No," I said firmly. "My whole life was what I had before. Safe, predictable, hollow. This, us, the music, that's living." "Morgan." Her voice broke slightly. "I'll need to make arrangements with the university, set up remote research protocols. Dr. Chen's already approved a traveling study component." I was babbling now, academic jargon masking the terrifying thrill of what I was proposing. Ren silenced me with a kiss, right there in my office, not caring who might see. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. "You're really considering this?" "I'm not considering it," I replied. "I'm doing it." The ancient musicians we study didn't just sit in caves analyzing their instruments. They traveled, performed, lived. Later that evening, I stood in my apartment, looking at my carefully organized life. Books lined the walls, degrees hung in perfect alignment, everything in its proper academic place. My phone buzzed with a text from Ren. "Band meeting tonight, bring your wild side." I smiled, already reaching for my keys. The degrees could hang crooked for a while. I had some living to do. Packing up my office the next day, I found an old photo of myself from graduate school, young, serious, desperate to prove myself to the academic world. "You have no idea what's coming," I whispered to her, tucking the photo away. The security guard winked as I left, carrying a box of books and artifacts. "Rock on, Doc," he called after me. I laughed, realizing I finally could. 1 year later, I stood backstage at the Montgomery Performing Arts Center, adjusting my blazer, now adorned with subtle archaeological patches, over a vintage Desert Storm shirt. Through the curtain, I could hear the unprecedented mix of academics and rock fans filling the venue. "Ready to make history again?" Ren appeared beside me, guitar slung across her back. Her blonde hair now had streaks of purple, but her green eyes still held that same spark that had first drawn me in. "Already did," I smiled, gesturing to the display in the lobby. Our traveling exhibit, Ancient Rhythms, A Living History of Music, had broken attendance records at every stop on the tour. Tonight was its homecoming. Dr. Chen approached, beaming. The International Journal of Archaeological Science wants to publish your findings. They're calling it a paradigm shift in how we study ancient musical cultures. Tell them they'll have to wait. Ren grinned. The doctor's about to perform. The house lights dimmed, and I took my place at the keyboard. Around the stage, carefully positioned display cases held the ancient instruments that had started it all, now part of our living, breathing performance. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer's voice boomed. Please welcome Dr. Morgan Walsh and Desert Storm, presenting Echoes Through Time, a musical archaeological journey. The show began with traditional archaeological footage projected behind us, showing the original discovery of the lyre. As the images played, I started with a classical piece that morphed into something more primal, more alive. Ren's guitar joined in, weaving ancient patterns through modern riffs. In the front row, I spotted Mrs. Peterson, trying to hide her foot tapping. Next to her, Dr. Harrison was openly filming with his phone. Even my old graduate school advisor had flown in, sitting among teenagers in band t-shirts. Halfway through the set, Ren stepped up to the microphone. A year ago, a brilliant archaeologist broke all the rules to prove that music isn't just something we study, it's something we live. She turned to me, her eyes soft. Morgan, you didn't just help us understand ancient music. You showed us that love, like music, transcends time. My fingers nearly slipped on the keys as she pulled something from her guitar case, a small carved box that looked suspiciously like an ancient artifact. I had this made, she said, opening it to reveal a ring, using the same techniques they used thousands of years ago, because some traditions are worth keeping. The audience erupted as I nodded, tears streaming down my face. Lisa Wolf whistled from behind her bass, and Dr. Chen was openly crying. We finished the show with our signature piece, a composition that began with a reconstructed sound of ancient instruments and built into a full rock symphony. As the final notes faded, the distinction between past and present, academic and artist, seemed to dissolve completely. Later, at the after-party in the museum's main hall, Ren and I danced among the exhibits that had once seemed so untouchable. My engagement ring caught the light, its ancient patterns matching the ones carved into the displays around us. Dr. Walsh, a young student approached, clutching a program. Your work inspired me to switch my major to archaeological musicology. Just wait, I told her, squeezing Ren's hand. We're just getting started. The museum's new wing, Living Archaeological Music, would open next month. Our next tour would include workshops at universities across the country. And my office, now split between the museum and recording studio, had never felt more alive. No regrets? Ren asked as we swayed to the music, ancient artifacts watching over us like proud ancestors. Only that I waited so long to break the rules, I replied, pulling her closer. Above us, the museum's new motto gleamed, the past is present. And for once, both my worlds were in perfect harmony.